Pacific all lost time. Judge Garmo, it's all yours.
Thank you, bailiff. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's call the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. Scoring judges, if you could please look to your two buttons on the lower left of your screen. Remember to keep your audio and video off. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants, meaning the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and myself. Can we please have appearances from the attorneys, starting with the plaintiff?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Deeksha Walia, and I, along with my co-counsel, Mr. Julio Baker, will be representing the plaintiff, Ms. Stevie Rogers, in today's proceedings.
Afternoon to all of you.
Afternoon.
Defense?
Good afternoon, Judge Garmo. My name is Sonali Mehta. I'm joined today by my co-counsel, Mr. Stephen Becker.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And together, we represent the defendant in today's trial, Ms. Drew Mars.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Afternoon to all of you. Let's move to pretrial matters, starting with the plaintiff. Are there any pretrial matters before we get started?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, we would like to invoke the Rule 615 for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring the party representatives.
Are you designating a party representative?
Yes, Your Honor. Our party representative is Ms. Stevie Rogers.
And defense?
Your Honor, Ms. Mars will be in court today throughout her trial as well, as we've stipulated.
All right, aside from those two, everyone else is constructively excluded.
Yes, Your Honor, and at this time, I would like to ask for preferences. Due to the unique format of this trial, with all due respect to the court and Your Honor, would it be okay if we stayed seated for objections?
That is completely up to you and your preference.
Yes, Your Honor. And Your Honor, we would just like to inform Your Honor that Exhibits 1 through 7 have been pre-admitted according to the pretrial order. And would it be okay that we use them at any point during trial, or would you like us to publish them to the jury beforehand?
If they're pre-admitted, you can use them as you see fit. Just make a record when you do it.
Yes, Your Honor. And Your Honor, Exhibits 8 through 18 have not been pre-admitted, but would it be okay to screen share and while we're doing authentication and assume that it's out of the purview of the jury?
Again, that's completely fine. Just make it clear what you're doing.
Yes, Your Honor. And Your Honor, I would like to confirm that you have the bench book that contains Faye's complaint and answer, Judge Jackson's pretrial order, the stipulations between both parties, the case law, as well as the Midlands Rules of Evidence.
Yeah, I've got it all right here.
And Your Honor, lastly, I would like to direct your attention to the Slayer statute. According to the Slayer statute in Midlands, we have to prove the defendant purposefully or knowingly caused the death of Agatha Lee, hence shall not receive any part of the decedent's estate, even though Drew Mars, the defendant, was the sole beneficiary of Ms. Agatha Lee's estate.
Understood.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening statements.
All right, thank you. Defense, anything else?
Nothing further, Your Honor. We're ready for opening statements.
All right, as we're now moving to opening statements, everyone, all the judges should make sure that you are now in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio unless you are the individual who is speaking. Counsel for the plaintiff, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Today, you're going to hear about a beloved author in the Midlands community, an 80-year-old woman named Agatha Lee, who unfortunately didn't lose her life to natural causes, but instead lost her life to a pill. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll learn that Agatha didn't make this mistake by herself. She lived with a caretaker, who's the defendant in today's trial. Ladies and gentlemen, we will provide you with all the evidence that is out against the defendant, and we will show you exactly how and why the defendant committed this murder, and that it came down to one thing: money. Agatha Lee's will and estate were at risk, and the defendant really needed that money. You'll learn that the defendant had to act fast or lose everything. You see, members of the jury, this is Agatha Lee. Agatha Lee wasn't your normal 80-year-old grandmother. Agatha Lee was a world-renowned author who was very famous in her community. But you'll learn she led a very private lifestyle because she lost most of her family members to some very devastating accidents. You'll learn that she had one living relative, her pride and joy, and Miss Stevie Rogers, her granddaughter. I would like you all to meet Miss Stevie Rogers. Miss Stevie Rogers and Agatha undoubtedly had a very close relationship. You'll learn that in 2008, Agatha Lee left her entire $20 million estate to Miss Stevie Rogers. But you'll learn how in 2018, things took an unexpected turn for the defendant. You'll learn that while the defendant was living alone with Miss Agatha Lee, that the defendant was able to convince her to put her and give her the will in its entirety. You'll learn that the defendant did this because she really needed that money, ladies and gentlemen. But you'll learn that when Stevie Rogers came to visit her grandmother, and they ended up having a conversation about this will, everything changed. You'll learn about how on August 14, all in one day, the defendant planned and executed the murder of Agatha Lee, and that it all started from that one conversation. You'll learn that Miss Stevie Rogers and Miss Agatha Lee were having a conversation behind closed doors, and that they decided that Agatha would be contacting her lawyer to remove the defendant entirely from her will. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll learn that at the end of this conversation, Miss Stevie Rogers walks out of the door and bumps into the defendant who was listening in the entire time. Ladies and gentlemen, it was in that moment the defendant, she clenched her fist. She clamped her teeth down and said, "No way." Ladies and gentlemen, it was at that moment that the defendant decided act fast or lose everything. You'll learn how in that same day, the defendant is known to go to the pharmacy to go and get an over-the-counter pill called chlorandramine that she already knew Agatha was deathly allergic to. And you'll also learn how later that day, the defendant was seen entering into Agatha's room right before she takes her pills. But ladies and gentlemen, we will prove to you that the defendant was seen entering Agatha's bedroom at 9:35 p.m. The next morning, Agatha was dead. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll learn that lo and behold, the cause of Agatha's death was 2 chlorandramine pills that she took from her pill dispenser, and that the time of death was after 9 p.m., ladies and gentlemen. We will prove to you that the defendant is responsible for Agatha Lee's death. We will prove to you that the defendant, who was in complete control of her estate and her will, killed her for the money, ladies and gentlemen, because she had to act fast or lose everything. And ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly why we have brought this lawsuit before you today. Because in Midlands, according to the Slayer statute, no person who purposely causes the death of another can receive a part of that person's will. So what that means for us, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have the burden of proving to you that the defendant intentionally tried to kill Miss Agatha Lee. Now, because today is a civil trial and not a criminal one, we also have a lower burden of proof. We have to prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, this simply means, what do you believe is more likely? The defense will come before you and try to spin this set of facts. But at the end of the trial today, with all the evidence presented, everything against the defendant, if you believe that it was more likely that the defendant was responsible for this murder, then you must find her liable. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will meet our burden. We will do that by calling 2 witnesses to the stand today. First, you'll hear from Miss Stevie Rogers. She'll tell you about how close her relationship was with her grandma and how nothing had changed. And she'll tell you about how the defendant did some very interesting things leading up to her grandmother's death. She'll tell you about the defendant listening into their conversation. She'll tell you about the intimidating remarks the defendant made to her and she'll tell you that the defendant was seen walking into her room holding something. Ladies and gentlemen, she'll tell you that she's never touched Agatha's pill dispenser and that the only person that was in the house was the defendant, her caretaker. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll also call a private investigator to the stand, and Mr. M.J. Bond. Mr. Bond will tell you that he launched a completely independent investigation and came to the conclusion that Agatha Lee was the most likely conclusion, that Drew Mars, the defendant, was the most likely conclusion as to who killed Agatha Lee. Ladies and gentlemen, he'll tell you that he was able to come to this conclusion because the defendant left some evidence behind. Mr. M.J. Bond will talk about a bag that was full of chlorandramine pills that was found in the defendant's closet. He'll talk about a fingerprint that matched the defendant that was found on that bag, and that 2 pills that were switched out of Agatha's pill container, well, they have the defendant's fingerprints on those too. So ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this trial, when my co-counsel, Ms. Deeksha Walia, comes before you, she'll walk you through all the evidence. She'll show you how the only reasonable conclusion is that the defendant committed this murder. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant had to act fast or lose everything. And that is why we will ask you to find the only conclusion that is supported by the evidence. We will ask that you find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, whenever you're ready.
She was set up to be taken down. Now, the plaintiff just came up here, and they told you that in 2018, Drew Mars was working as Agatha Lee's nurse and caretaker. That's true. They told you that Agatha Lee died later that year after she had a fatal allergic reaction to a medicine. That's true too. But members of the jury, they told you that Agatha Lee died because of Drew Mars. That Miss Mars had to act fast and kill. That's not true. So I want to start by introducing you to Drew Mars. You're going to learn today that for the past 10 years of her life, Miss Mars has spent every waking moment making sure Agatha Lee had anything she wanted or needed. The two were so close, they were almost like family. Agatha even decided to put Drew Mars into her will. But you're going to hear how all that changed in 2018 when Stevie Rogers, Agatha's granddaughter, came to visit. See, Stevie Rogers hadn't spoken with her grandmother for an entire decade. But in 2018, her trust fund ran out. She was broke. So she showed up on her grandmother's doorstep, begging to be put back into that will. 1 month later, Agatha Lee was dead. And Stevie Rogers was framing Drew Mars for her death. See, members of the jury, that's why we're here today. Stevie Rogers is suing Drew Mars under something called the Slayer statute so that she can take her grandmother's inheritance even though she wasn't in her will. To do that, the plaintiff has to prove to you that it is more likely than not that Drew Mars intentionally killed Agatha Lee. They won't be able to meet that burden today. And to help you understand why, I want you to keep 3 things in mind throughout today's trial. First, the plaintiff has no hard evidence proving Drew Mars did this. Second, Drew Mars had no motive to kill. And third, we're only here today because Stevie Rogers framed Drew Mars. Now, I want to take you through each part of our case, starting with that first part. See, Mr. Baker just came up here and he told you a very specific story. The plaintiff believes that Drew Mars purchased chloroandramine, snuck into Agatha's room, and switched her pills. Members of the jury, you're not going to hear from a single witness today who saw any of that. No one who saw Miss Mars purchasing chloroandramine, not a receipt to prove that she did. No one who saw her switching those pills at all. Next, you'll learn that Drew Mars doesn't have a motive in today's case. See, the plaintiff wants you to believe that Miss Mars had a motive because she believed she was being taken out of the will and she had to act fast. Members of the jury, you're going to hear from Miss Mars herself today and you'll learn the opposite is true. See, Miss Mars overheard a conversation between Agatha Lee and Stevie Rogers, where Stevie asked to be put back in the will. But Agatha said no. And members of the jury, you don't just have to take Miss Mars's word for it, because you're also going to hear from a woman named Ryan Cabrera. Now, Miss Cabrera was one of Agatha Lee's closest friends, and they actually spoke on the same day as that conversation. Miss Cabrera will tell you exactly what Agatha told her. Stevie asked for something that morning. Agatha had to say no. So finally, we're going to show you exactly what Stevie Rogers did when she realized she was never getting her grandmother's will money. See, members of the jury, Stevie Rogers knew that Agatha was allergic to chloroandramine, and she was alone in the house before Agatha died. You're going to hear that Stevie Rogers knew all she had to do was pin this whole thing on Drew Mars, and she would get all that inheritance money. So from the first moment Agatha's body was found, Stevie accused Drew Mars of murder. She filed this lawsuit stating that Drew Mars poisoned her grandmother before she had even seen an autopsy or a toxicology report. Members of the jury, over the course of today's trial, the plaintiff is going to tell you to ignore all the evidence pointing to Stevie Rogers. They're going to tell you that Drew Mars is a killer and she deserves to be taken down. But I want you to remember that underneath all those accusations, there's a human being. A woman who spent the past 10 years of her life making sure Agatha Lee was happy and healthy. A woman who woke up one morning to find the closest thing she had to family was gone. A woman who was set up to be taken down. At the end of today's trial, we're going to ask you to see through that setup. We're going to ask you to find Drew Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Pause for just a second to let all the judges score. And before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I would now ask everyone, all the judges, to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right hand of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and the witness at the same time. Plaintiff, whenever you are ready, you can call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Jaleel Baker on behalf of the plaintiff. At this time, we'd like to call Miss Stevie Rogers to the stand. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hello, my name is Stevie Rogers.
Miss Rogers, why don't you tell us where you're from?
Well, I actually grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, but now I travel a lot, kind of bounce around from place to place. Usually warmer places, but I'm not too picky.
What do you do for a living, Miss Rogers?
I pick up a lot of odd jobs wherever I go because I'm always traveling. So I like to do a lot of different things. Sometimes I'll pick up a music gig. I've written a few novels. I get the writing thing from my grandma.
Oh, Miss Rogers, why are you here today?
My grandma died back in 2018, and I think that her caretaker, Drew Mars, had something to do with it. I just want to make sure that I get justice for her in whatever way that is.
Well, Miss Rogers, I want to start talking to you about your relationship with your grandma. Can you first tell us who she was?
My grandma was Agatha Lee. You might have known her. She was one of the most famous mystery authors of all time and one of the smartest people that I've ever met.
And what was your relationship like with your grandmother?
We were really close for most of my life. I used to stay every summer at her house in Alabama while I was growing up. Every day she'd make these pitchers of sweet tea for me and we'd sit on her porch reading mysteries together. I still think about that all the time.
Was your relationship with your grandmother always like this?
We tried to stay close, but, things changed. When I was in college, my parents were killed in an accident with a drunk driver. And after that, it was hard to see my grandma without thinking about them. So I just stopped reaching out as much.
Well, did she ever reach out to you?
Yes. At the start of 2018, she reached out to me because she was making some changes to her will.
Would you recognize the will if it was in court today?
Yes, I would.
Does this look like the will that she changed?
Yeah, that's the most recent version of her will.
It's a fair and accurate copy?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to enter Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor. We've stipulated to the facts in this document.
It's admitted.
Now, can you tell us what your grandmother changed with this will?
Well, she took me out of it and put her caretaker, Drew Mars, in it instead.
Well, do you know why she did something like this?
Yes. She sent me a letter where she talked about how distant we gotten and how...
Objection, Your Honor, under Rule 1002, best evidence. May I explain?
Sure.
Your Honor, Stevie Rogers was just referring to a letter her grandmother sent her, characterizing the statements in that letter. We actually have that letter based on discovery, and if plaintiff's counsel is going to discuss it, they should offer it into evidence per Rule 1002.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Go ahead.
We aren't talking about this letter at any length and don't wish to bring any statements in from this letter. We're simply using this letter to show Miss Stevie Rogers' subsequent action and that she went to go and visit her grandmother after finding out about this letter.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Your Honor, if the testimony is simply that I received a letter from my grandmother and then I went to visit then I went to go visit her, we don't have an issue with that. But what the witness was doing was characterizing statements from the letter. Since we have that letter, the jury should be able to evaluate those statements for themselves.
I do agree that the witness had started to characterize the contents of the letter. However, broadly, I think she had gotten into the contents. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Move to strike that testimony, Your Honor.
Such that any was elicited. It's stricken.
And now, Ms. Rogers, you'd recognize that letter if you saw it?
Yes, I would.
Now, Ms. Rogers, after you received this letter, what'd you do?
Well, I felt really bad about how distant our relationship had gotten. I had a lot of regret about the way I'd handled things after my parents died. It had been almost 10 years since they died, so I decided that it was time to see my grandma again.
Did you ever get to go and visit her?
Yes, I went to her house in Alabama that summer to go visit her. That was the last address I had for her. But by the time I got there, she'd already moved out of the house.
Were you able to find your grandmother?
Yes. My grandma lives pretty off the grid. She didn't even have a cell phone. But I knew I needed to see her, so I hired a private investigator to help me find out where she'd gone. Finally, I found her at her new house in Midlands.
Oh, well, I want to talk to you about what your relationship was like when you went to go visit your grandmother. How were things when you got there?
I had to explain why I had stopped reaching out, but once we finally talked, it was like I was finally able to come to terms with what had happened to my parents. After that, everything went back to normal. It was like I was 15 again, drinking sweet tea on the porch with my grandma and talking about our favorite books.
Well, was there anything different about your guys' relationship at this time?
The only thing that was different was that my grandma had a caretaker living with her now, Drew Mars.
I want to talk to you a little bit about some of your experiences with the defendant. What was it like with the defendant being around?
Drew definitely made her presence known. She would ask me every day when I was planning on leaving, and she was really attached to my grandma. She
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation that Drew Mars was really attached to Agatha Lee, her grandmother.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Sure.
Your Honor, this is not a statement of speculation, as she hasn't gone into the mindset, what thoughts or feelings of Drew Mars. She's simply making a lay witness opinion based on her rationally based perception after she's explained numerous experiences that she's gone through that made her feel like this, Your Honor. So this isn't speculation.
Response, Your Honor.
Sure.
The witness just said that Drew Mars was attached to her grandmother. We have no problem with her testifying about things that she saw or things that were said, but going that extra step to say that Drew Mars was attached to her grandmother, that's the speculation that I'm objecting to, Your Honor.
I think she was towing the line. I'm going to overrule the objection, but I would advise that the witness should stick to what she experienced.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, did the defendant ever do anything that was concerning to you?
Yes. Other than constantly interrupting my conversations with my grandma and just being around all the time and interrupting us, there was actually one day when my grandma and I actually had a conversation about her will, and Drew was just acting really strange afterwards.
Well, Ms. Rogers, can you tell us what day this conversation was?
August 14th, the night before my grandma died.
Well, why don't you tell us what this conversation was about?
My grandma and I were in her study and we were talking about our relationship. It was really nice. That's when she told me that she was planning on putting me back in her will.
Did she tell you anything else, Ms. Rogers?
She told me that she was planning on taking Drew out of her will entirely and leaving everything to me. She said she was going to call her lawyer about it in the morning.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay to the second part of that statement that she was going to call her lawyer about it in the morning.
Your Honor, all of these statements are a then existing mental state exception under Rule 8033. Each of these statements expresses a plan and future actions that Agatha intended to take that day. So these are an exception to hearsay under 8033.
Counsel, before you respond, am I correct that you're only objecting to the final statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, then what's your response to 8033?
Your Honor, it's our belief that that doesn't meet that exception, Rule 8033, that she was calling her lawyer in the morning. I haven't heard any foundation that she was actually going to do that. It doesn't meet that exception, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may.
Sure.
Yes, this entire conversation was about Miss Agatha Lee's plans and what she was going to be doing in order to execute those plans in relationship to her will. The statements that came out were, "I will be calling my lawyer." Your Honor, those are definitely statements of intent and fall under 8033.
I'll overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Rogers, can you go ahead and tell us again what your grandmother said in this conversation?
She said she was going to take Drew Mars out of the will and that she was going to talk to her lawyer about it in the morning.
You mentioned the defendant was somehow involved. Where was the defendant during this?
Well, she wasn't in the room where we were having the meeting, but when the conversation was over and my grandma and I left the room, we opened the door and Drew was standing right there, glaring at me.
Did the defendant do anything?
She had her fists clenched. Her face was really red. She looked really angry. She started to leave for lunch with my grandma, but as they were walking away, she turned around and looked at me and mouthed, "No way."
Well, I want to talk to you about anything else that you may have experienced with the defendant on August 14th. Did you see the defendant again that day?
Yes, I saw her again around 9:30 that night.
And what did you see the defendant doing this time?
I saw her go into my grandma's room. which was weird because I knew that my grandma wasn't in her room. I had just left her in the study.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of personal knowledge that she knew her grandmother wasn't in her bedroom.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Sure.
This witness was just getting into the testimony about how she had just left her grandmother in the study, which is a separate room from her grandmother's bedroom, and that after this interaction, that she saw the defendant go into her grandmother's room. So this is just another lay witness opinion based on her rationally based perception.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
First off, we have a good faith basis to believe that there was actually a 5-minute difference between when Miss Rogers left her grandmother and when she saw Drew Mars. Because of that, and because of the fact the study and the bedroom are actually connected, Your Honor, this witness can't testify that she knows her grandmother wasn't in the bedroom 5 minutes after she left her. It's outside of her personal knowledge, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may respond one last time.
Sure.
Your Honor, these are statements that are a lay witness opinion about what she experienced. We have a witness here that says she was in the house, that she was in her grandmother's room, in another room with her grandmother, and that shortly after, almost immediately after to Miss Stevie Rogers, she sees the defendant go into a separate room where her grandmother wasn't. Your Honor, this goes to weight over admissibility, as this witness is allowed to testify about what she thinks happened based on her rationally based perception. And that's all she's done, Your Honor.
So we're battling a little bit over a technicality here. I'm going to sustain the objection only because I think, Mr. Baker, the way you just said it was a little different from how the witness said it. What you just said, I think, is fine. But the witness was stating basically what she was just stating facts. And I think the witness has to stick to what she knows to be true. So I'm going to sustain the objection under those circumstances.
Move to strike that testimony, Your Honor.
Yes, that small portion is stricken.
So, Miss Rogers, why don't you tell us again what you saw the defendant doing later that night?
I saw her go into my grandma's room, and I had just left my grandma in the study.
Did you see anything else that the defendant was doing?
Yeah. She was walking towards her room, and she was holding her hand like this, kind of like she was holding something.
Well, do you know when your grandmother died, Miss Rogers?
Yes, she died later that same night.
Do you know how she died, Miss Rogers?
Yes, I saw the autopsy report.
You recognize it if we pulled it up?
Yes, I would.
And now, Miss Rogers, can you tell us what this autopsy says about your grandmother's death?
It says that my grandma died from taking 2 chlorandramine pills.
Does it say when, Miss Rogers?
It says that she died in between, I believe, 9 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on August 15th.
So after 9 o'clock, right, that night.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of this drug, chlorandramine?
Yes. It's a medicine that my grandma was deathly allergic to.
And how did you know that, Miss Rogers?
Drew Mars told me. She was the one who handled my grandma's pills.
Thank you, Miss Rogers. We have nothing further at this time.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Disappeared there for a second. Hi, Ms. Rogers. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Before I start, can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So, ma'am, I want to start by talking about your relationship with your grandmother. Now, on direct examination, you told us the two of you were really close. Is that right?
We used to be before my parents died, but then we fell out of touch. It was just hard to see her after that.
Ma'am, you did go visit your grandmother on July 4th, 2018. Is that right?
Yes, it was the anniversary of my parents' death, and I knew I needed to see her.
And before July 4th, 2018, you actually hadn't seen your grandmother in years, right?
No, It felt like every time I even talked to her, I just remembered everything about my parents again. So I couldn't.
And from 2011 to 2018, you never went to visit your grandmother, right?
No, I just couldn't bear it.
From 2011 to 2018, you never wrote any emails to your grandmother?
No, I mean, it's something that I regret now, but at the time, I just couldn't.
And from 2011 to 2018, you called your grandmother one time. Is that right?
Yes.
Well, Ms. Rogers, I want to talk about what changed. In February of 2018, you received a letter from your grandmother. Is that right?
Yes. In the letter, she was talking about our relationship and how distant we gotten and how everything felt like it had changed. And I just felt awful.
Mr. Becker, could you put Exhibit 10, that letter, on the screen for us? Now, ma'am, this is the letter we were just mentioning, right?
Yes.
Looks just the same as the last time you saw it?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, defense offers Exhibit 10 into evidence.
Your
Any
Honor,
objections?
yes, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Okay. Response?
Yes, Your Honor, we're offering this letter for the effect it had on the listener. Now, first of all, the only substantive fact in this letter is the fact that the will was changing from Stevie Rogers to Drew Mars. We've stipulated to that fact. We've already entered that will into evidence. Everyone in this room, Your Honor, agrees to that fact in this letter. We're rather offering it for the effect on the listener to show that it was because of this this letter that Stevie Rogers knew she had been taken out of the will. And that's the reason she went to go visit her grandmother, unlike what she told us on direct examination.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Sure.
There is about 5 paragraphs on this page that detail very personal information and are definitely not qualified to come in just to show notice and an effect on the listener. And like opposing counsel had mentioned, the simple fact that is already agreed upon in today's case that Stevie Rogers was, disinherited and taken out of the will at that moment, is this document isn't necessary for using that and for those purposes at all. This is a hearsay document, Your Honor, with 5 paragraphs worth of information in it.
Response, Your Honor?
Sure.
Now, opposing counsel just brought up these other paragraphs in the letter. Your Honor, it's our belief that those paragraphs contain statements about how Agatha felt about their relationship, like Stevie Rogers just testified in the last question I asked. Your Honor, it doesn't matter whether or not those statements are true, whether or not Agatha Lee was telling the truth here. What matters is that Stevie Rogers believed those statements about the relationship to be true. Once she believed the relationship had been broken, that's when she went to go visit her grandmother to try to get back into the will. That's what we're using this letter for, Your Honor.
Counsel, is your objection? I'll give you a last response if you want it.
Your Honor, we're ready for a ruling.
Okay. I'm looking at the letter here. I'm going to allow the letter in at this point, but solely for any effect purposes as proffered by counsel. I'm not allowing it in for its substantive truth. So Exhibit 10 is admitted with a limiting instruction to be taken only for effect.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Rogers, you received this letter from your grandmother on February 1st, 2018. Is that right?
Yes.
In this letter, your grandmother tells you that she doesn't remember the last time you called without asking for money. Is that right?
Yes. I had
Objection, Your Honor, to unfairly prejudicial.
Do you want to explain?
Yes, sir. Your Honor, this is a document that, again, was admitted for the sole purposes of showing intent and notice that Ms. Rogers was notified about the will. Opposing counsel just made a healthy argument about that and is now highlighting portions of the exhibit and document that are purporting truth matter within them, Your Honor. And at this point, these statements are prejudicial. They are not going towards an effect or a notice to this witness at all, and are therefore prejudicial in its effect.
Response, Your Honor? We've already established that Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee didn't talk to each other, didn't call for about 7 years. Ms. Rogers just testified to that on her own without this letter. So we're not using this statement for its truth value. That truth is already on the record. we're using this statement to show how it affected Miss Rogers. When she realized how damaged this relationship had become, when she realized the way her grandmother was perceiving their relationship, that's when she went to go visit her grandmother. We're using it for that purpose, Your Honor. It's not unfairly prejudicial.
Your Honor, if I may respond one last time.
Last response, then I'll roll.
Your Honor, opposing counsel had just made an argument that this is specifically for notice of when her grandma notified her about this will. This does not even have that statement within it. This highlighted portion is clearly being used to attack the credibility and relationship that Miss Rogers had with her grandmother. Opposing counsel said they would be using this document for one reason and are bringing up statements that they inherently said hold truth value and that they're not using this document for. And here they are.
I'm going to sustain the objection as it pertains to why this document was admitted. I agree with Mr. Baker that we admitted this document solely for the purpose of notice. So as it's being used currently, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Understood, Your Honor. Mr. Becker, could you click one more time for me? Thank you. Now, ma'am, in this letter, your grandmother told you that she was changing her will. Is that right?
Yes.
She said she was leaving her money to Drew instead of you?
Yes.
Oh, ma'am, this made you upset, didn't it?
I mean, it made me upset that she was upset about it. The whole letter was talking about our relationship and how upset she was about that.
Ms. Rogers, I want to be clear about the timeline here. Mr. Becker, could you put the timeline on screen for us? Now, ma'am, you didn't go visit your grandmother in March right after she sent you this letter, did you?
No, I went to go visit her on the 10-year anniversary of my parents' death.
You didn't go visit her in April or in May, right?
No.
But ma'am, then your trust fund ran out. Is that right?
My trust fund ran out in June, yes.
To be clear, for the past 10 years, you had been living off of a trust fund. Is that right?
I had the trust fund, but I was also doing odd jobs too.
Ma'am, that trust fund started with $2 million in it. Is that right?
Yes, and then I used it to pay for law school and living and other expenses, so it ran out.
Well, ma'am, in your own words, you spent that money traveling, right?
Yes, but I also spent it on other things too.
Well, like you told us, in June of 2018, your trust fund ran out of money, right?
Yes, in June.
And then on July 4th, you went to go visit your grandmother. Is that right?
Yes, on the 10-year anniversary of my parents' death.
And 1 month after your trust fund ran out, that's when you started reconnecting with your grandmother. Is that right?
I started reconnecting with my grandma after I saw that letter and after I had come to terms with everything that we'd gone through.
Ma'am, July 4th, that's months after you got that letter, right?
Yes.
1 month after your trust fund ran out. Is that correct?
Yes.
Ma'am, I want to go ahead and fast forward and talk about the day, August 14th. Now, on August 14th, you knew your grandmother was allergic to chloroandramine, right?
Yes, Drew Mars told me.
You knew that chloroandramine was available over the counter at any pharmacy?
Yes, that's what Drew told me.
Ma'am, you're claiming that Drew Mars snuck into your grandmother's room and switched her pills with chloroandramine. Is that right?
Well, I saw her go into my grandma's room that night, which was weird because she never goes into my grandma's room unless she's filling up her pills. And she does that on Saturdays. This was a Tuesday.
Mr. Rogers, I'm glad you said that. I want to break that down. What you saw Drew Mars do was walk to your grandmother's room with her hand out. Is that right?
With her hand clutched like this.
Ma'am, you didn't see if there was anything in her hand, did you?
No, because it was closed, like she was holding something.
Ma'am, you never saw Drew Mars purchase chloroandramine, did you?
No.
You never saw Drew Mars put chloroandramine into your grandmother's pill organizer, did you?
No, I didn't see that myself.
Ma'am, you were actually home the entire day of August 14th, weren't you?
I was home, but I was in other parts of the house. I didn't see Drew all day.
Well, you were actually home alone for parts of the day. Isn't that true?
Yes, that's true.
Mr. Rogers, I want to talk about why you're here today. I mean, you know what the Slayer statute is, don't you?
Yes, that's what I'm suing Miss Mars under.
That's right. You're suing today under the Slayer statute, which is a law that says a person can't inherit money from someone who they've killed. Is that right?
Yes, I don't think that Drew Mars should get money for killing my grandmother.
Miss Rogers, you know that if you win here today, well, Drew Mars isn't going to keep your grandmother's money, right?
Yes, that's exactly why I'm suing. I don't think that she should get a reward for what she did.
You know, the money, it doesn't stay with the state of Midlands, right?
No, I mean, I'm pretty sure it goes to me.
That's right, ma'am. You get the money if you win here today.
Yes, but I'm suing because I don't want Drew Mars to have it after what she did.
Ma'am, if you win today, you know you get your grandmother's mansion, right?
Yes, I get the house that she lived in, which would
You
be
get her, excuse me, ma'am. You get the rights to her famous book, right?
Yes, her legacy.
And you get almost $20 million in cash. Is that right?
Yes, that's what my grandma had.
Mr. Becker, could you put that timeline back up for us? Ma'am, you filed this lawsuit on August 20th. Is that right?
Yes.
This lawsuit claiming that Drew Mars poisoned your grandmother with chloroandramine. Is that right?
Yes.
Ma'am, from August 15th to August 20th, you never saw a toxicology report on your grandmother, did you?
No, but just the week before, Drew had told me about my grandma's fatal allergy to chlorandramine. So I thought that might be it.
From August 15th to August 20th, you never saw an autopsy on your grandmother, right?
No, but the timing was too weird. Drew was acting too weird. I knew that something was up.
Ma'am, on the day you filed your lawsuit accusing Drew Mars of poisoning your grandmother, you didn't even have an official cause of death from the police. Do I have that right?
Yes, but then when we did get that cause of death, it was chlorandramine, the exact same thing that Drew was telling me about just a week before.
So, ma'am, what you're saying today is you knew your grandmother died based on chloroandramine before there was an autopsy?
What I'm saying is that Drew Mars was just telling me that my grandma could die from chlorandramine. Then, after Drew Mars gets written out of the will, my grandma ends up dead. It's too weird. That's why I wanted the police to get that toxicology report.
Thank you, ma'am. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, we just have a brief redirect. Ms. Rogers, the opposing counsel asked you a lot of questions about your trust fund and why you were visiting your grandmother. Can you tell us why you went to go see your grandmother?
I went to go see my grandmother because she was clearly distraught about our relationship. And you know what? I was too. I really regretted the way that I handled things after my parents died. And I just wanted to make things right.
Was it about money at all?
No, it was about getting back with the only family that I had left. It was about fixing things for myself.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. We have nothing further at this time.
Anything based on that defense?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, I assume Ms. Rogers can be excused. And let's all just take a brief pause for the judges to catch up on scoring, and then we'll keep going. All right, plaintiff, whenever you are ready, call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, plaintiff calls Mr. M. Bond to the stand. Wish to proceed?
Go ahead.
Mr. Bond, please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Bond. MJ Bond.
Mr. Bond, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm not as famous as my movie counterpart, although people do say I dress better. But I'm a private investigator, which basically means I investigate cases, find missing persons, and I help people solve issues that they have.
And how does a private investigator find cases to work on?
Well, counselor, the work finds me. People usually seek me out, hire me for my work, and I then proceed to do the investigation. We have a little saying at my firm, if you want something found, just come and find me.
How many cases have you worked on?
Dozens. So many, probably some that you've actually read about.
What's your goal in the cases that you work on?
When I work on a case, the only thing I can guarantee my clients is that I can find a conclusion out of the evidence I collected.
How are you involved in today's case?
Well, I'm involved in today's case because I was hired twice by Mr. Rogers, Mrs. Rogers, excuse me. One time to help find his missing grandmother, and the second time to investigate her death.
So I'd like to talk to you about the second time you were hired. When did Miss Rogers call you?
Miss Rogers called me August 15, 2018 at around 8:45 a.m. And she told me where the house was, and I headed on down.
What time did you arrive at that house?
I arrived an hour later at 9:45 a.m.
Where was Miss Rogers when you arrived?
Miss Rogers was upstairs in her grandmother's room. And after further examination of the room, I determined Miss Lee had passed away.
How did your investigation begin?
Well, I like to think of investigations like a puzzle, right? I need to know what picture I'm putting together before I can start fitting the pieces. So what I did was I interviewed the people that were there that could give me any relevant information. First was Stevie Rogers, and then Drew Mars.
Objection, Your Honor, to an improper opinion. May I be heard?
Sure.
Now, Your Honor, Mr. Bond isn't a police officer. He's not a police detective. He doesn't work for the state in any capacity. And we've heard next to nothing about his qualifications as an investigator. Now, what he was just talking about here was the kinds of things you need to look for at a crime scene, the best ways of collecting relevant evidence. These are expert opinions, Your Honor. They're not something that a lay witness like Mr. Bond can testify to.
Your Honor, if I may be heard?
Sure.
Your Honor, we have already laid the foundation that Mr. Bond is an investigator, and his role in today's case was to gather facts. And he's simply stating how he was gathering those facts. He interviewed some witnesses, and that is what he was doing. There's no expert opinion being elicited. There's no opinion that he's providing. He's simply stating the facts that he gathered during the course of his investigation.
Yeah, I don't think we're quite in 702 yet. I'll overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Bond, I'd like to talk to you about your conversations. So let's start with Miss Stevie Rogers. What was your conversation with Miss Rogers about?
I talked to Miss Rogers, and she cautioned me that there was more to this case than met the eye. And yeah, after that, I proceeded on to...
Your Honor, to hearsay.
Your Honor, if I may be heard?
Sure.
Your Honor, we're not using this for the truth of the matter asserted, simply the detective's subsequent actions. It is already on the record during the course of Ms. Rogers' direct examination that she had stated that there was more to the eye, that there might be something more involved. Therefore, we're not using this testimony for the truth of the matter asserted, simply the fact that the subsequent actions the detective, the investigator took.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Put very simply, Your Honor, their central allegation in today's case is that there's more to Agatha Lee's death than meets the eye. Mr. Bond just testified that Stevie Rogers told him that there was more to Agatha Lee's death than meets the eye. It's certainly being used for the truth of the matter asserted, and even if they're truly not, it has a heavy enough implied truth value that the jury's going to take it for.
Your Honor, if I may be heard?
Sure.
Your Honor, it's already come out in the testimony of Stevie Rogers. The truth value has already been stated to the members of the jury. Therefore, this is no longer an out-of-court statement, and we're not using it for the truth of value, the truth value in this testimony, simply the fact that the subsequent actions the investigator took after hearing these statements.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Sure, then I'm going to rule.
Your Honor, Stevie Rogers didn't testify there was more to this case than meets the eye. We believe that if she had testified to that, that would have been speculation. Nothing like this is on the record, and it's simply hearsay.
She didn't say those words, but I think she made it pretty clear in her testimony that that was essentially her opinion. I'm going to let it in for its effect value such that it has any. So it's objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Bond, what did Ms. Rogers say during your conversation?
She cautioned me that there was more than to this case that met the eye.
Do you know why she thought that?
Yes, she was concerned that it was a possibility that Drew Mars may have overheard a conversation that Agatha Lee had with Miss Rogers. And in that conversation, she told me that Agatha Lee told her that she was planning on writing Stevie Rogers into the will and Drew Mars out of the will.
Who is Drew Mars?
Drew Mars is the nurse and caretaker that lived with Miss Lee. I came to find out through my investigation that she also handled her medication as well.
And what was your conversation with Miss Mars about?
I asked Miss Mars kind of a rundown of their relationship. I came to find out that she was Miss Lee's primary caretaker, and Drew Mars handled everything from her health needs to her daily medication.
So after speaking with Miss Mars, what came next in your investigation?
Well, the second part of an investigation is what a lot of you would call clues. I go and I try to gather as much information I can that can help me and assist me in my investigation. So after that, I started trying to collect evidence, and I actually asked Miss Mars to search the room, and actually then went and searched her room.
What did you find when you searched her room?
Well, when I searched the room, I discovered an email in which she stated that she was going to become the sole beneficiary of Miss Lee's will.
Would you recognize that email if I showed it to you in court today?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
Mr. Baker, can we have that email? Is this that email that you were talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, is there an accurate copy?
It appears to be, ma'am.
Hasn't been altered in any way.
No, ma'am.
Your Honor, plaintiff moves Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objection?
We have no objections.
It's admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Mr. Bond, what does this email say?
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, basically, the email just says that Agatha told Miss Mars that she was going to become the sole beneficiary of that will.
Now, what happened after you searched Miss Mars' room?
After I searched Miss Mars' room, I attended the will hearing a few days later. And it was at this will hearing that it was made known that Drew Mars was the sole beneficiary of the will. And Miss Mars actually said that she didn't know, which was a red flag for me.
Why was that a red flag for you?
Oh, just as I mentioned, I had discovered this email in her room where she clearly says that she was the sole beneficiary. So it was a little bit confusing and concerning to me when at the will hearing, she acted like she didn't know.
Now, what happened after after the will hearing?
Well, after the will hearing and all this information came to light, Detective Khan actually sent the body for an autopsy.
What did the detective find?
In that autopsy, the detective found that the cause of death was the 2 pills of chloramine.
And what else? What is chloramine?
Chloramine is a standard over-the-counter heartburn medication, but it was extremely fatal to Miss Lee because she had an allergy to it. I learned this through my interview with Drew Mars, who told me she had this allergy.
What else did the detective find?
The detective also found a toxicology report.
And what does that toxicology report say?
The toxicology report said that the bottle of 24 pills found in Miss Mars's closet were actually chloramine. And it also went and talked about some of the other pills that were found in Miss Lee's bathroom, which was vitamin B and aspirin.
And did you find out where was this bottle of chloramine found?
Ma'am, the bottle of chloramine was found in Miss Mars's closet.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Sure.
Now, Mr. Bond just testified to where a specific piece of evidence was found. He hasn't laid any foundation for how he knows that. He's talking about the police investigation here.
Your Honor, if I may?
Sure.
If I may proffer, the witness will testify that he was part of the investigation and part of the search of the room and saw when the bottle was found by the detective in Mr. Mars's closet.
Response, Your Honor?
Briefly.
If that is the case, Your Honor, then Mr. Bond has a foundational requirement to testify to the foundation before he gives a conclusion like this.
Yeah.
I think it's fodder for cross. I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Bond, where was this bottle of chloramine found?
The bottle of chloramine was actually found in Miss Mars's closet.
And were you able to find out who bought this bottle of chlorandamine?
While we weren't able to find out who bought the chlorandamine, we couldn't find any credit card statements or receipts. I did learn from Miss Mars that Miss Mars had went to the pharmacy the day before, and that pharmacy sold chlorandamine.
Now, let's talk to you about the fingerprint analysis. What did the detective find about the fingerprint analysis?
So the detective ran a fingerprint analysis, and in his findings, he found that Miss Mars's fingerprint was actually on the black bag with the chlorandamine in it.
Would you recognize that black bag if I showed it to you?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
Is that black bag you were speaking of on the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Fair and accurate picture.
It appears to be so.
Hasn't been changed or altered in any way.
Not that I can tell, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, plaintiff moves exhibit 15 in evidence.
Any objection?
No objections.
It's admitted.
Now, Mr. Bond, what did this black bag contain?
This black bag was found in Miss Mars's closet, and inside of the bag was the pills of chlorandamine, and on the bag was Miss Mars's fingerprints.
And were there any other fingerprints found by that analysis?
No, ma'am. Only Miss Mars's.
And were there any other fingerprints found by the analysis conducted by the detective? Anywhere else?
No, ma'am. Only Miss Mars's.
Thank you. No further questions?
Defense, cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Good afternoon, Mr. Bond. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Before I start, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, sir, and I love that suit you have on.
Thank you very much, sir. I want to begin by talking about how you first became involved in today's case. Now, it's true that on August 15th, Stevie Rogers called you, right?
Yes. Miss Rogers called me and let me know that her grandmother was deceased.
She called you up, you understand now, just about 10 minutes after Agatha Lee had been found dead.
Yes, based on the autopsy reports.
But sir, when Stevie Rogers called you that morning, she didn't say my grandmother is dead and something seems off, did she?
No, she said her grandmother was murdered, but that's typical in cases like this.
So you say it's typical. 10 minutes after finding her deceased 82-year-old grandmother, Stevie Rogers said my Nana was murdered. Isn't that true?
Yes, but in cases where it involves someone's family member, people tend to jump to conclusions. It happens all the time.
So I'm just asking what Stevie Rogers said. She said my Nana was murdered.
Yes, sir. That's what happened.
So at this point, no toxicology screen had been conducted?
No toxicology screening, no autopsy. It was just her perception. But again, it's really typical, especially with close members of family.
So sir, I want to talk about whether that kind of behavior continued after you arrived at Lee Manor. Now, when you got there, Stevie Rogers was talking a lot about Drew Mars, right?
Yes, she was.
From the moment you arrived, Stevie Rogers kept accusing Drew Mars of killing Agatha Lee, right?
Yes, again, not out of the ordinary, especially when someone's close relative dies. They want a solution right then. So I heard it, but that didn't investigate. That didn't affect the integrity of my investigation.
So you say that wasn't out of the ordinary. Looking at Miss Lee's body, you didn't see any reason to believe that she had been poisoned, did you?
Okay, no, for sure. When I looked, I couldn't see any signs that there was foul play. But again, family members usually have heartstrings attached. It's really hard to handle sometimes for them.
The police detective who was there, she didn't have any reason to believe that Agatha Lee was poisoned either.
Yes, sir. She didn't have the evidence yet to make that conclusion. Yes, you're right.
But sir, on the other hand, Stevie Rogers, well, she was adamant that you needed to test Miss Lee's blood for poison, right?
Yes, she was.
She was even adamant that you needed to take pictures of the pill organizer next to Miss Lee's bed. Isn't that true?
Yes, she was.
So, sir, after these interactions with Stevie Rogers, you continued to collect some more evidence. You looked for clues, like you said, on direct examination.
Yes, precisely.
So I want to talk about what clues you did and didn't find during the rest of that investigation. Now, sir, you understand that the plaintiff is claiming today that Drew Mars swapped Agatha Lee's pills with chloroandamine, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
But sir, no one you spoke to ever claimed to have seen Drew Mars swapping anything, did they?
Well, no, sir. If that happened, they wouldn't need me.
No one you spoke to ever claims to have seen Drew Mars purchasing chloroandramine at that pharmacy?
No.
So you talked about a black bag with pills on it on direct examination. No one you spoke to ever claims to have seen Drew Mars put anything into that bag, did they?
No.
You also talked about a fingerprint. To be clear, that fingerprint, it was on the exterior of the bag, right?
Yeah, you usually open a bag from the exterior. So yeah, it was on the exterior.
You didn't find any of Drew Mars's fingerprints inside that bag, did you?
No, not inside the bag, but there were smudges on the outside that sometimes indicates that the action of trying to wipe things off had happened. But no, you're right. We did not find Miss Mars's fingerprints on the inside.
And so what I want to make very clear here is that you did not find a single fingerprint belonging to Drew Mars on that actual bottle of chloroandramine pills itself.
No, just on the bag with it inside. But we didn't actually find a fingerprint of hers on the bottle. No.
But so in the end, you did conclude that Drew Mars had killed Agatha Lee. Isn't that true?
Yes, in accordance with the other evidence. I know you just didn't mention it all, but like I mentioned on my direct examination.
Objection, Your Honor. I apologize for the delay. Improper opinion, if I may be heard.
Sure.
I was playing with the position with Zoom.
That's okay.
The attorney is trying to elicit an expert opinion as to saying who was a suspect and who was not a suspect. We have not entered the witness as an expert during the course of our direct examination. Therefore, asking a witness that is a lay witness regarding an expert opinion who is or is not a suspect is not permissible. This witness is not an expert, therefore cannot make a conclusion regarding who is and is not the suspect.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Sure.
No, we are certainly not offering this opinion as an actual true opinion. That would be a bit antithetical to our case to say that Drew Mars is actually the person that killed Agatha Lee. We're offering this opinion to attack it, Your Honor. It's not an improper opinion.
How does that, I'm just to defend to Mr. Becker, I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's still his opinion. Doesn't there have to be a foundation for that?
Your Honor, my understanding of 701 is that it only matters. The foundational requirement is only there if we're interested in offering that opinion as truth. If we're just offering it to show his bias and the way he concluded his investigation, there's no foundational requirement for that, Your Honor.
All right, counsel, it was your objection. Anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, it's still an expert opinion, and opinions are for you cannot offer opinions for lay witnesses. And he's still, opposing counsel is still trying to offer an opinion regarding who is or is not a suspect. And that needs to be, you need to lay the foundation that the witness is an expert in order to offer that opinion.
I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, in the end, you did decide that you believed that Drew Mars had killed Agatha Lee. Isn't that true?
Yes, I did after the conclusion of my investigation. That's what the evidence pointed to, yes.
And when you came to that conclusion, you gave several reasons for it, right?
Yes, a lot of them I mentioned on my direct examination, but yes.
So I want to talk about those reasons and whether they point to Drew Mars alone. Now, sir, one of the reasons you settled on Drew Mars was because she had knowledge of Agatha Lee's allergy, right?
I wouldn't say settled. That's what the evidence led me to believe. But yes, she did have knowledge of the allergy.
So you know that Stevie Rogers also had knowledge of that allergy, didn't she?
Yes, Drew Mars did tell Stevie Rogers that.
So one of the reasons you concluded that Drew Mars was the person who killed Agatha Lee was because that bag was found in her closet, right?
Yes, also with her fingerprint on it as well.
But sir, you know that there were no locks on Drew Mars's door, were there?
No, there weren't any locks on her door.
No locks in her closet?
Not that I'm aware of.
And you know that if someone like Stevie Rogers had wanted to plant that bag there, well, they physically could have access to that closet, couldn't they?
Access, yes, but unless Stevie Rogers had some way to plant a fingerprint as well, that was more of the concluding factor that made me think Drew Mars was involved. Not just the access to the closet, it was more of the fingerprint and physical evidence that was attached to it as well.
So that's a yes to my question. Stevie Rogers had access to that closet, yes or no?
Yes, it's a yes that she did have access to the closet. However, I don't think that's the main point of why I said it was Drew Mars. You know what I mean?
So another reason you came to Drew Mars as your conclusion was because she had access to Agatha Lee's pill organizer, correct?
Yes, as her caretaker, she was the one handling all the medicine and her medical needs. So yes, I did do that.
But once again, sir, in your own words, so did Stevie Rogers, didn't she?
Yes, Miss Rogers would be able to access it. However, no evidence led me to believe that.
And sir, finally, another reason you settled on Drew Mars as the person who killed Agatha Lee was because she had access to chloroandramine, right?
Yes, and also she went to a pharmacy the day before where they sold chlorandramine.
Well, so here's what I want to make clear. Chloroandramine, it's an over-the-counter medication, right?
Yes, it is. Easy to buy.
It can be picked up at any pharmacy.
Yes.
And you know that if Stevie Rogers had wanted to get her hands on some chloroandramine, she could have picked it up at any pharmacy.
She could, but I highly doubt that. Like I mentioned in my direct, we looked for credit card statements, we looked for receipts, and I have a good belief that if Stevie Rogers did go and purchase chlorandramine, we would have found out. I pride myself in doing the dirty work, so I think I would have found it.
Well, hang on, sir. You say that if Stevie Rogers had purchased chloroandramine, you would have found hard evidence of that. You didn't find any receipts that showed Drew Mars purchased chloroandramine, did you?
Oh, I didn't find any receipts, but we actually had her in the pharmacy that sold it.
Sir, you didn't find any credit card statements that showed that Drew Mars purchased chloroandramine, did you?
Again, no, but she was in the pharmacy that sold it. So that's,
you know, Drew Mars was a home nurse, right?
The first part cut out. I couldn't hear you.
You know that Drew Mars was a home nurse, correct?
Yes, Drew Mars was a home nurse.
You know that home nurses go to pharmacies, right?
Yes, which is why I asked her what she purchased at that pharmacy, and she couldn't remember. I thought that was a little bit too convenient.
So, sir, returning to my earlier question, it's true that Stevie Rogers had access to chloroandramine if she wanted to buy it, right?
Yes, it's possible. If she wanted to go and buy it, she could.
So, sir, you can see here some similarities between Drew Mars and Stevie Rogers. I want to talk about one major difference between them. Now, sir, you know that both Drew Mars and Stevie Rogers were at Lee Manor on the night of the murder, correct?
Yes, that's to my knowledge.
But out of those two people in the house that night, only one of them offered to pay you, right?
Yes, I was hired. Drew Mars never tried to hire me. No.
Out of those two people in the house that night, only one of them offered to pay you $25,000 for your investigation, right?
Yes, that's my standard rate.
That was Stevie Rogers, right?
Yes, that was Miss Rogers.
Sir, at the time you made your conclusion, Stevie Rogers had already paid you $10,000, right?
Yes, but that was on something completely unrelated to this, but I had received a $10,000 payment, yes.
At the time you made your conclusion, sir, Stevie Rogers still owed you $25,000 more, didn't she?
Yes, she did owe me still $25,000.
And so at the end of your investigation, the person you settled on out of those two on the night of the murder was the person who had offered to pay you $25,000.
I don't agree with the way you're asking that question. I chose Drew Mars because her fingerprints were on the bottle. Her fingerprints were on the bag that had the bottle of the drug that killed Miss Lee. I understand that Miss Rogers did pay me. However, we found no damning physical evidence for Stevie Rogers as we did Drew Mars. That's in conclusion why I came to that.
So redirecting you to my question, the person you settled on out of those two people was the one who hadn't paid you, yes or no?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, a brief one. Mr. Bond, opposing counsel just came before you and told you that that Stevie Rogers had knowledge of allergy, had access to the closet, had access to pill organizer, and chlorandramine. So why did you? What evidence led you to believe that it was Drew Mars?
Well, simply put, any skilled investigator would know that you have to look a little bit past the primary evidence, right? So what I did was when we found the physical fingerprint on that bag that had the chlorandramine in her closet, that was enough for me.
Thank you. No further questions.
Anything based on that defense?
We have no recross, Your Honor.
Witness is excused. Anything further from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff rests his case in chief and asks for a 5-minute recess, barring time.
I think we are essentially exactly an hour from all lost. So let's take a 5-minute recess. Let's be back at 4:07.
Yes, Your Honor.
Judges, as we take our recess, this is your reminder that this video will still be being streamed publicly on YouTube. So it's probably best to mute yourselves and turn off your camera.
All right, judges, if you could please turn on your videos or send me a message through chat just to let me know that you're here, present, and ready to proceed with trial. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, looks like we got everybody. So then once the competitors come in, and I believe they should be here, Judge Garmo, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Once everyone is back and ready to go, defense, it's your case. Call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense at this time calls Drew Mars to the stand. Mr. Nybrod, I think your camera's still on. May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Hi, Ms. Mars. I'm going to be asking you a few questions today. Can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Could you start by introducing yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello, my name is Drew Mars.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was born in New Zealand. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings. They're all still back at home. I moved to America when I was 20 to study nursing.
And do you know somebody named Agatha Lee?
I do. I was Agatha's caretaker. I started working for her when I was a junior in college. I was with her for over 10 years.
What were your responsibilities in that job?
Mostly, I was responsible for checking on her health, but really, I did anything that she needed. Cooking, cleaning around the house. I lived with Agatha full time.
Could you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Miss Lee?
Agatha felt more like family than a patient. I didn't have any family in America, but Agatha always took care of me. I really loved her.
Do you know if Agatha Lee had any other family members?
Only her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers. Agatha would call Stevie her perfect grandchild, and Stevie was always calling and visiting. But things changed after Stevie's mum died in a car crash in 2008.
Ma'am, what do you mean by that? What changed?
Stevie stopped coming to visit. I never heard her call Agatha or reach out. It was pretty awful to watch. Agatha had just lost her daughter, and then she lost contact with her only grandchild.
Oh, Ms. Mars, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about Agatha's will. Have you ever seen her will before?
Yes, ma'am. I have actually seen 2 versions of it.
Okay, let's start with that first version. What was that?
That was in 2008. After Stevie's mum passed away, Agatha changed her will to leave her entire estate to Stevie.
What about that second version of the will? What was that?
That was in 2018. Agatha changed her will again. She actually decided to leave everything to me.
Ma'am, how did you react to that?
It was extremely generous. Honestly, I couldn't believe it when she told me.
Ma'am, do you know if Agatha Lee ever told Stevie Rogers that Stevie was being taken out of the will?
Yeah. Agatha showed me a letter that she sent Stevie in February 2018, letting her know that she was being taken out of the will.
Ms. Mars, I want to go ahead and fast forward to the day of August 14th. Mr. Becker, could we get that timeline back up on the screen? And I want to go ahead and focus in on August 14th, 15th. So, ma'am, could you tell us what happened that morning?
I mean, it was pretty normal. I woke up, started cleaning the house. I usually make Agatha tea in the morning, so I took her one to her study at 11:30. I heard Stevie in there with her.
Did you hear any part of their conversation?
Yeah. Stevie demanded that Agatha put her back in the will, but Agatha refused. She said that she wouldn't give Stevie a penny, that she wanted Stevie to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet.
Your Honor, hearsay to Agatha Lee's statements.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. We're offering these statements for the effect they had on the listener, Stevie Rogers. It's our contention in today's case that after hearing these statements, Stevie Rogers knew that she was never going to be put back in the will, and that's why she took the actions that we're here in court to discuss, poisoning her grandmother. We're offering it for that effect, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may? Your Honor, the defendant, Drew Mars, can't offer statements about the effect on Stevie Rogers. She's not able to offer statements on what effect Agatha's statements had on Stevie Rogers. She may testify the effect that they had on herself, but she cannot testify the effect they had on Stevie Rogers.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Your Honor, we're not asking Ms. Mars to testify how this statement actually affected Stevie Rogers. What matters with this hearsay issue is the reason we're using this statement. We're using this statement, as we'll outline clearly in closing argument, for the effect it had on Stevie Rogers. We're certainly not asking Ms. Mars to speculate about what it did do to Stevie Rogers, although she will testify about how Stevie Rogers reacted when Stevie came out of that room and actually said something to Ms. Mars.
If I may be heard then, Your Honor?
Yeah, then I'll roll.
If opposing counsel isn't offering it for the effect or stating explicitly the effect it had on Stevie Rogers, then they are offering this for the truth of the matter asserted, that this is what Agatha meant when she stated these statements. Because she cannot testify, the defendant cannot testify about the effect that they had on Stevie Rogers, and therefore they cannot come in as the truth value either.
Yeah, I don't agree. I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Ms. Mars, you were telling us about the conversation you overheard between Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee. Could you finish what you were saying?
Yes, ma'am. They were talking in Agatha's study, and Stevie asked to be put back in her grandmother's will, but Agatha said no. She said that Stevie needed to learn how to be an adult and how to stand on her own 2 feet.
Ma'am, what happened next after you heard Agatha refuse to put Stevie back in her will?
Agatha came out of the study. She asked me to get her car because she had a lunch meeting.
Well, did Stevie Rogers say anything to you?
After Agatha left, Stevie looked at me and said, "Don't count your millions just yet."
Ma'am, what did you do next?
I took Agatha to lunch at noon, and then I headed to the pharmacy to pick up some things while she was at lunch.
Ms. Mars, do you remember what it is you bought at the pharmacy on that day?
No, ma'am, I'm sorry. I have to go to the pharmacy a lot for Agatha, but I don't remember what I bought that day.
Did you buy chloroandramine?
No, ma'am. No, Agatha was deathly allergic to chloroandramine. I told anyone who brought it into the house that they couldn't because she might mistake it for any of her other medication. Just one pill could have been really harmful for Agatha.
So, ma'am, what did you do after you left the pharmacy?
I picked up Agatha from lunch and we headed home. We got back around 2.
Well, Ms. Mars, when you left the house with Agatha at 12, who was home?
It was just Stevie.
What about when you returned to the house with Agatha? Who was home then?
Again, it was just Stevie when we got back.
So, ma'am, what happened after you and Agatha both got back to the house?
I cleaned up around the house a bit. I made Agatha and Stevie dinner and served it to them at 6 p.m. I went to my room a little while later and I was asleep by 9:30.
Ma'am, have you been sitting here in court all day today?
Yes, ma'am. I've been here.
Did you hear earlier when Stevie Rogers said she saw you walking towards Agatha's room at around 9:30, 9:40?
Yes, ma'am. I heard Stevie say that, but she must be confused. I was asleep by 9:30 that night.
All right, Ms. Mars, I want to go ahead and talk about what happened the next morning. I know this is difficult. Could you tell us what went on when you woke up?
I mean, at first, I didn't know anything was wrong. I woke up around 7. I did some chores, but Around 8:30, when Agatha still wasn't up, I took her a coffee to her room.
What did you see?
Agatha was in her bed, but she wasn't moving. I tried to wake her, but I couldn't feel a pulse. I felt like I couldn't breathe.
What did you do next?
I ran to Stevie's room to get help. She was the only other person in the house. I didn't know who else to go to.
Ma'am, what did you say?
I keep telling her that her grandmother needed help, that we needed to call her an ambulance.
What did Stevie Rogers do when you told her Agatha needed help?
Stevie just stared at me. Then she picked up the phone and she called the police. She told them that I had murdered her grandmother.
Ma'am, between the time that you woke Stevie Rogers up and she called the police to say that you murdered Agatha Lee, did Stevie go see Agatha's body?
No, ma'am. No, she didn't.
Mr. Becker, you can take the timeline down. Thank you. Ma'am, what did Stevie Rogers do?
Stevie just jumped out of the bed and she called the police. She didn't act surprised or cry. She didn't even go check on Agatha.
Thank you, Miss Mars. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Cross-examination.
Cross, Your Honor. Ma'am, I know this is hard, but I'm going to ask you a few more questions. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Take your time. Ma'am, you were Miss Lee's caretaker, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's right.
She hired you when she had just had a heart attack, right?
Yes, ma'am. I was hired in 2008.
And that heart attack was induced by chlorantramine, wasn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Chlorantramine is a heartburn medication. Agatha was deathly allergic to it.
Exactly. And you started helping her with day-to-day activities, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you
I
started
was her caretaker. I did anything that she needed of me.
Exactly. And you also helped her handle her medication, right?
Yes, ma'am. That was one of my responsibilities.
And you knew that Agatha, Miss Lee, was a wealthy woman, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And
Agatha was an extremely accomplished author.
And you also knew that you were handling the medication of a very wealthy woman, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But you grew up not so wealthy, correct?
That's right, ma'am.
In a small home.
We got by.
You grew up in a small home.
Yes, ma'am.
And while you were working for Miss Lee, your sibling got sick, right?
Yes, ma'am. My sister had a seizure in 2015. We were worried that it might have been part of a larger medical problem, but luckily nothing has happened since then, and she's been doing really well.
But you were worried that she may pass away, right?
Yes, ma'am. It was always a worry.
And you were worried that she may pass away before Agatha did, right?
Yes, ma'am. I guess.
You were worried, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And Miss Lee actually changed her will to include you, right?
Yes, ma'am. In 2018, Agatha changed her will. She left everything to me.
Which would mean that you would get $20 million once Miss Lee died, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's what Agatha explained to me. Honestly, I couldn't believe it at the time.
And with $20 million, that would help get your sibling treatment, wouldn't it?
I guess, ma'am. Agatha paid me extremely well when I was working for her. I earned $80,000 a year. I was lucky enough to always have money to send home. I didn't need the inheritance to support my family.
Yes, ma'am. But can you bring you back to my question? This $20 million would help with paying for your siblings' treatment, right?
I guess so, but I always had enough money to send home to my family.
But it would help, right?
I guess so. I guess
So-
20 million would help anyone.
In June of 2018, Miss Stevie Rogers moved into the house, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And she started rekindling her relationship with her grandmother, Miss Lee, right?
I think so. They were spending a lot of time together. Stevie came and she was still living with Agatha until she passed away.
And Miss Lee was slowly spending more time with Stevie than she was with you, right?
Yes, ma'am. I thought it was nice that Agatha was finally getting to see someone else. Agatha needed people in her life.
But she was spending more time with Miss Rogers than she was with you, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. I made sure that they had time to be with each other. Stevie hadn't been at the house for 10 years.
So on August 14th, you heard a conversation, right?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And you talked about it a little bit on direct examination, correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And you were in court today when Stevie Rogers testified,
Yes, ma'am, I've been here all day.
and you heard Miss Rogers say that during that conversation, Agatha was going to replace you in that will, right?
Yes, ma'am, but the conversation didn't happen the way Stevie said it did.
But
Stevie asked Agatha to be put back in the will, but
ma'am, bring you back.
Agatha said, I'm sorry, ma'am.
You're okay.
Your Honor, I would ask that opposing counsel doesn't interrupt the witness.
Your Honor, if I may.
Sure.
It was simple yes or no question.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Briefly.
Your Honor, not every question can be answered with a yes or no. She asked her about a conversation by Stevie Rogers. Miss Mars has been asserting throughout trial today that conversation didn't happen.
Your Honor, if I may,
Sure.
I simply asked what she heard Stevie Rogers say in court. It was a simple yes or no question.
Yeah, I think if the witness needs to clarify, it's redirect. I do think in this instance she was going a bit beyond the question. So I would advise the witness to stick to answering the question.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Ms. Mars, you did hear Stevie Rogers say that you were going to be replaced in Miss Lee's will, right?
No, ma'am, I didn't hear that at all.
Wait,
I heard Stevie, I'm sorry, ma'am.
you were in court today when Stevie Rogers testified, right?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And you heard Stevie Rogers say that you were going to be replaced in the will, right?
Yes, ma'am, but I'm sorry, that's not how that conversation happened.
And later that day, you heard another conversation, right?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
You were driving Miss Lee to lunch, weren't you?
Yes, ma'am, I was. Agatha had a lunch meeting.
And you heard Miss Lee call someone named Kirby, right?
That's right. Kirby is Agatha's personal attorney.
Exactly. You heard her call her personal attorney, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And during that conversation, Miss Lee asked for an appointment for that same week, didn't she?
Objection,
Yes,
Your Honor. Hearsay to that statement by Agatha Lee.
Response?
Your Honor, this is regarding the will, and under Rule 8033, a statement regarding the will is excluded and may be stated in court.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure.
Your Honor, the specific portion of Rule 8033 that I believe opposing counsel is referring to, it says that hearsay statements that prove the fact believed can be admitted if they relate to the terms or the validity of a will. Your Honor, to be clear, the statement here is Miss Agatha Lee saying to somebody on the phone that she wants an appointment. Your Honor, we have no foundation to believe that conversation must have been about a will. For all we know, Agatha Lee could have been meeting with her lawyer for a million other reasons. It just doesn't fit that exception, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Sure.
The question was, you heard Agatha ask her attorney to be put for an appointment for that week. Asking someone is not a statement, therefore it does not fall under the rule of hearsay. Asking has no truth value. There's no statement elicited in that question.
May I respond on those grounds, Your Honor?
No, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Move to strike.
Stricken.
Now, that same day, you went to the pharmacy, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
And you claim that you don't remember what you bought.
That's right, ma'am. I'm sorry. I have to go to the pharmacy a lot for Agatha. It was a trip 2 years ago. I don't think I saved a receipt.
But you remember what you heard earlier that day in Agatha's study between Miss Lee and Miss Rogers, right?
Yes, ma'am. I heard Stevie demand to be put back in the will, and Agatha said no.
You heard that that morning. You also remember the conversation Agatha had with her attorney in the car, don't you?
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
But you don't remember what you bought at the pharmacy, right?
No, ma'am, I'm sorry. I have to go to the pharmacy so often. I don't remember. I'm sorry.
And later that night, you heard Stevie Rogers say in court today that you went into Miss Lee's room, right?
Yes, ma'am. I heard Stevie say that, but I don't understand. I was asleep at 9:30 that night.
But you heard her say that, right?
Yes, ma'am, but I think Stevie must be mistaken.
And the next morning, Miss Lee was found dead, right?
Yes, ma'am. I went to go wake her up, but she wouldn't wake up.
She died from 2 pills of chlorandamine, correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's what the police said.
You're aware that chlorandamine, which is a heartburn medication, looks identical to Wintrin, right?
Yes, ma'am. Wintrin was the medication that Agatha took.
And she took it every night, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right before bed.
Yes, ma'am.
And on August 14th, she went to bed about 10 p.m.
I think so. That sounds about right.
It would be hard for you as a trained nurse to tell the difference between Wintrin and chlorandamine, right?
Yes, ma'am. The 2 pills are identical. That's why it's so dangerous for chlorandamine to be in the house. We were always afraid that maybe Agatha would mistake it for her Wintrin pills. That's why it was never allowed in the house.
And Agatha is not trained, right? She could get mistaken.
Yes, ma'am, it was possible. That's why we always had to be so careful.
And you're also aware that your fingerprints were found on 2 pills of Wintrin, right?
Yes, ma'am.
2 pills in a whole bottle of Wintrin, right?
Yes, ma'am. Wintrin was the medication that I gave Agatha.
And you're aware that your handprints, your fingerprints were also found on a black bag, right?
Yes, ma'am. The police told me that.
And that black bag was found in your closet?
Yes, ma'am. The police told me that they found a bag, but I've never seen it before, and I'm sorry, I don't know how it got in my closet.
But it was in your closet, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's what the police said.
And the black bag contained chlorandamine, didn't it?
Yes, ma'am. That's what the police said.
And there was a will reading, right, after Agatha's death?
Yes, ma'am.
And during this will reading, you acted surprised about the content of the will, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am. Stevie had been telling everyone for days that I had murdered her grandmother for the will money, and I was terrified that people would believe her.
Ms. Lodge, bring me back to my question. You did act surprised about the content, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am. I was terrified about what it would look like.
You stated that you didn't know you were the sole heir to the estate, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But you
I'm sorry.
weren't.
No, I shouldn't have done that.
But you weren't actually surprised, right?
No, ma'am. I knew back in February that I was getting the will money.
You knew that you were the sole heir.
Yes, ma'am, I did. Agatha told me back in February.
But you lied about knowing that, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You lied.
Stevie had been telling everyone for days that I had killed Agatha for the will money. I was terrified at the time.
Ms. Mars, you lied to the police about that, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Mars, the opposing counsel was just asking you some questions about why you acted surprised at the will reading when your name was read. Could you explain to the members of the jury why you did that?
Sure. Agatha had told me back in February that I was being put in the will. I was overwhelmed by that. When it came to the will reading, it was days after Agatha's death. Stevie had been telling everyone, the police, the private investigator, that I had murdered Agatha because I wanted her money. I was terrified that when people heard that I was getting her will money, that people would believe Stevie that I murdered Agatha, but that's not true. I loved her.
Thank you, Ms. Mars. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything based on that?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, witness is excused. Let's take a brief pause to allow the judges to finish scoring. And defense, whenever you're ready, you can call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Ryan Cabrera to the stand. And before we begin, Your Honor, we'd just like to note for the court that we're going to be using that same timeline demonstrative, but with certain portions redacted in accordance with 615.
That's fine. Do what you need to do. And Mr. Baker, if you need to object, feel free.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right. Could you start by introducing yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Cabrera.
And what is it that you do for a living, Ms. Cabrera?
I'm an author. I write biographies, mostly.
How'd you become an author?
Slowly. I started off writing young adult fiction, but I don't much relate to children. Once I found my knack for biography, my career took off from there. I've been working in the field for about 10 years now.
Ma'am, what's your connection to today's case?
In 2018, I decided to write a biography of the author Agatha Lee. I reached out and she was interested, so I began interviewing her and getting to know her. We became great friends in the months leading to her death.
I want to go into a little more detail about your relationship with Miss Lee. How long did you know her?
We were friends for about 6 months. We would meet pretty frequently, a few times a week, and talk about her life, her work, all sorts of things, really.
And how would you describe your relationship with Miss Lee?
It was good. It started off very professional, but by the end of it, we were close friends. I began to really look forward to our meetings.
How often did those meetings occur?
A few times a week. We would play backgammon and go on these long walks. We'd go to lunch together, things like that.
I want to focus in on Agatha Lee's estate. You said that the two of you were close. Did she ever mention her will?
Sure, she'd mentioned it. I mean, we talked a lot about her life's achievements and what she wanted to become of her legacy. I mean, her work, things like that.
Did she ever show you the will she filed in 2018?
Yes, she did show it to me.
Miss Manta, could we get Exhibit 9 on the screen, please? What do you see here, ma'am?
This is the will from 2018.
Is that a fair and accurate copy of that will?
Yes, I believe so.
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
It's admitted.
Ms. Cabrera, what were the terms of this 2018 will?
Well, it says that she would leave her entire estate to Drew Mars.
And in that will, does Agatha Lee write anything specifically about her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers?
Yes, as you can see, it says, I specifically intend to exclude my grandchild, Stevie Rogers, from receiving any benefit from my estate or under this will.
Ma'am, how long before Agatha Lee's death did she write this will?
It was 6 months before she died.
So in the 6 months between filing this will and Agatha Lee's death, did she ever express any interest in maybe putting Stevie Rogers back in?
No, she never mentioned putting Stevie back in the will.
Did she ever talk about changing it again at all?
No, she didn't.
We heard a little bit today about how Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee got closer in July of 2018. Even after July, did Agatha ever say anything like that?
No, never.
All right, I want to focus in on August 14th now, the day that Agatha Lee died. Did you see her that day?
Yes, I did. We had lunch together that day. I had just finished my first draft of the biography, and I wanted to get Agatha's edits.
How was she acting during your meeting?
She was more quiet than normal. You know, she kept changing the subject, and she was less talkative.
Did you ask her what was wrong?
Yes, I asked if she was doing all right.
What'd she tell you?
Well, she said, Stevie asked me for something this morning. I had to say no.
Objection, Your Honor, to these statements of Agatha Lee.
Response,
Your Honor? No, I assume that opposing counsel is objecting to hearsay. Would I be correct in that?
Yes.
Your Honor, these statements actually fall under that same exception to hearsay we were discussing earlier, Rule 8033. And as was mentioned before, there's a specific provision at the end of that rule which allows for statements of memory or belief to be used to prove the matter remembered or believed if it relates to the terms or validity of a will. Now, that's exactly what this is. Agatha Lee is making a statement of memory, and we are using it to prove the matter believed that Stevie Rogers asked for something and that she had to say no. But this is a statement about a will, and so it's admissible.
Your Honor, if I may.
Sure.
There's been absolutely no foundation about how this witness knows that this conversation and statements from Agatha Lee were in fact in regards to a will. And furthermore, they're really not fitting under the exception 8033 as they weren't direct statements of intent or plan or her any emotional states at that time. Your Honor, so at this time, these are still hearsay and not admissible under 8033.
May I respond on those grounds, Your Honor?
Yes, and can you specifically say the statement that we're dealing with here?
Yes, Your Honor. The specific statement was, Stevie asked me for something this morning. I had to say no. Now, opposing counsel mentioned that Ms. Cabrera doesn't know that this was about a will. And we agree, but Your Honor, under 104, when the admissibility of a statement is dependent on an external fact, such as whether or not this is a conversation about a will, what matters isn't the statement itself or what the witness who's testifying to it knows, but rather we have to look to the totality of the circumstances to determine whether or not that preliminary question exists. And the standard to do so is just a preponderance of the evidence. In this case, Your Honor, all of the circumstances surrounding this statement and this conversation indicate that this is referring to that same earlier conversation about a will. Both sides agree that on the morning of August 14th, Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee had a conversation about a will. What Drew Mars told us is that in that conversation, Stevie Rogers asked to be put in the will, and Agatha Lee said no. That lines up perfectly with what Ms. Lee told Ms. Cabrera here. The circumstances meet that preponderance standard, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I may respond one last time.
Yeah, I'll give you last response, then I'm going to rule.
Yes, Your Honor. Opposing counsel brought this objection response as the exception to hearsay here was 8033, and that it was in regards to a will. There's been no evidence or testimony laid, and in the totality of circumstances from this witness, we actually have no clue, and it is a strong contention in today's case whether or not that conversation was about the will. And then there's no evidence, no testimony, no argument that Mr. Becker has made that has made it more likely that that conversation was about the will. And furthermore, the statements in themselves on the face do not meet the 8033 then existing mental state conditions. That's my final response, Your Honor.
May I respond once more, or are you ruling?
I'm going to overrule the objection. You can continue.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera, what time was it that Agatha Lee told you that Stevie had asked her for something that morning and that she had to say no?
Well, it was during our lunch, so it had to have been around 1 p.m.
Did she say anything else in that conversation about Stevie Rogers?
Yes, she had said, "I love Stevie. I hope she forgives me."
Was that the last time you saw Agatha Lee, ma'am?
Yes, she died the next day.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Cross-examination whenever you're ready, counsel.
Good afternoon, Ms. Cabrera. I'm just going to be asking you a couple questions about some things you mentioned on direct examination, all right?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I want to start exactly where you left off, talking about that conversation you mentioned.
Of course, yes.
You actually have no idea, ma'am, what that conversation was about, right?
No, I don't. I asked Agatha, but she changed the subject, so I didn't want to push her on it.
Right, you don't know what Agatha told Miss Stevie Rogers at all, do you?
No, I don't know.
Because this was a private conversation between Agatha Lee and her granddaughter, right?
Yes, exactly. All I know is that Stevie had asked her for something and that she had to say no.
You don't know what it was that she had to say no about, though, right?
No, I can't be certain.
Well, you actually have no clue at all, Miss Cabrera. It could have been about anything, right?
Yes, of course. I don't know.
Miss Agatha Lee could have very well told her granddaughter that she was writing her back in the will, right?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Well, what you do know is that she mentioned something interesting about her lawyer, right? That she would be contacting her lawyer the next day.
She said that she had an appointment with her lawyer on Friday.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. The statement is that Agatha told Miss Cabrera that she would be planning on meeting with her attorney the next day. This is a textbook 8033, then existing mental state, where she's expressing her plan and further actions in the future. This is an exception to hearsay under 8033.
May I respond briefly, Your Honor?
Yes.
That's actually not what the statement was. Opposing counsel asked the question, but as Ms. Cabrera made very clear, the actual statement was, I have an appointment with my attorney. That's not a statement of intent. That's just a simple statement of fact. It violates 801.
I'm going to overrule the objection.
Yes.
So, Ms. Cabrera, just to be clear, you don't know what that conversation was about, but you do know she said she was going to be contacting her lawyer the next day, right?
She said she was meeting with her lawyer on Friday.
Right. Now, you talked a little bit about Stevie Rogers as well. You know that Agatha Lee loves Stevie, right?
Yes, they had an interesting relationship, but they were grandmother and granddaughter, yes.
Well, you know that Stevie Rogers came to visit her grandmother, and you saw that they were greater than ever, right?
I'm not sure if they were greater than ever, but Stevie did come back into Agatha's life around July. Yes, that's true.
We saw them hanging out and having a good time, right?
Yes, I saw them playing backgammon a few times.
And you actually would agree with me that this was the happiest that you ever seen Agatha, right?
No, I'm not sure what you mean. The happiest I'd ever seen her was one of our lunches.
It's your sworn testimony that when Stevie Rogers was around, that wasn't the happiest time that you seen Agatha?
I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Baker.
Well, you do agree that Agatha was extremely happy during this time, right?
She was happier after Miss Rogers returned. Yes, that's true.
And you also know that the defendant lives with Agatha, right?
Yes, Drew is Agatha's full-time nurse.
She's her caretaker, right?
Yes, exactly.
And as her caretaker, you've seen Miss Mars, the defendant, give Agatha pills on several occasions, right?
Yes, of course. Miss Mars was responsible for administering Agatha's medications.
So you've seen the defendant hand Agatha pills before, right?
Yes, of course.
And you actually heard Agatha say that she would take anything that the defendant gave her, right?
They had a very trusting, loving relationship, yes.
Right. Now, I want to talk to you about your relationship with the defendant, if that's all right.
Of course.
You guys know each other pretty well.
Yes, I would say we were close friends by the end of our relationship. As I said, I had been writing her biography.
Right. And she actually called you before this trial to make sure that you could testify on her behalf, right?
Pardon me, the defendant? Yes.
Right. Miss Mars, the defendant, called you and asked if you would testify on her behalf, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm here.
And she actually offered you anything within Agatha's will if you did that, right?
Right, yes. So I asked for a collection of Agatha's unpublished works. You know, I'm a big fan and a friend of Agatha's. So that's what I asked for.
So, Ms. Cabrera, you're set to receive a part of Agatha's will yourself, right?
Yes, of course. And I would love to read those books.
And Ms. Cabrera, I just want to be clear. What you're telling us is that in an agreement with the defendant you made to testify, you would receive the books as well, right?
I believe that that's how it works, yes.
So I just want to be clear that if the defendant were to walk away with the estate, you would be walking away with a part of the will as well, right?
Yes, I would receive the unpublished works of Agatha Lee. I would love to read them.
Thank you. We have nothing further.
Any redirect?
None, Your Honor. We're ready to move to closing arguments, and Ms. Cabrera may be excused.
All right, thank you. Obviously, we are running a little bit close to all loss. We're doing okay, though. So plaintiff closer, whenever you're ready, you can begin. And this is just a reminder for judges as we head into closings that everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Plaintiff, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Act fast or lose everything. On August 14th of 2018, the defendant, Drew Mars, had to act fast and kill Agatha Lee, or she was going to lose everything. She had a lot to lose, members of the jury. Miss Lee's entire estate, $20 million, and her sibling that was sick. But the defendant's actions caused Miss Lee to lose her life, caused the world to lose a renowned author, and caused Miss Stevie Rogers to lose the only family she had left. And that's why we're here today. On August 14th of 2018, the defendant purposely caused the death of Agatha Lee. The defendant, Drew Mars, was the live-in caretaker of Agatha Lee, handled all of her medication, and handled all of her day-to-day activities. But on August 14th, everything changed. The defendant heard two conversations. One, where he learned Agatha was going to replace her in the will. And the second, the defendant heard Agatha call her personal attorney. And immediately after hearing these two conversations, the defendant went to the pharmacy and bought chlorandramine. Came home that same night, held the chlorandramine in his hand, and walked into Agatha's room, took out 2 pills of Wintrin with his fingerprints found on them, put them back in the bottle, and replaced them with 2 pills of chlorandramine, which the defendant knew Miss Lee was deathly allergic to, and then proceeded to hide that bottle of chlorandramine in her closet in a black bag, also with her fingerprints. The defendant acted fast. The defendant killed Agatha Lee before she even had the chance to meet with her attorney. Members of the jury, we as a plaintiff, we walked into this courtroom, we walked in with a burden. We had to prove to you the defendant purposefully caused the death of Miss Lee. And we had to prove that to you by a preponderance of the evidence. So let's break that down. Purposefully in Midlands means with the intent or hope that your actions cause a certain result. And preponderance of the evidence means more likely than not. Not a lot more likely, not 70, 80% more likely, simply more likely than not. 50% and a feather. And today, members of the jury, we prove to you that the defendant purposely caused the death of Agatha Lee. But members of the jury, this is not a criminal trial. We're not here to be proved that the defendant caused the death and convict the defendant on any criminal charges. We are here to determine whether the defendant should receive Miss Lee's estate. In Midlands, there's something called a slayer statute, which means that if someone purposely causes the death of another, the slayer, should not profit from the death that they have caused. What that means is, if someone kills another person, they should not receive any part of the decedent's estate, even if they were the sole beneficiary of that estate. Drew Mars was the beneficiary of Miss Lee's estate. But when Drew Mars took out those 2 pills out of the Wintrin bottle and put them back out of the pill organizer and put them back in the bottle and replaced it with 2 pills of chlorandramine, he purposefully caused the death of Miss Lee. So let's take it step by step, members of the jury. How have we proven to you that the defendant is a slayer? And how have we proven that he purposely caused the death of Miss Lee and therefore should not receive the estate? Well, we have learned today that the defendant was made the sole heir to Miss Lee's estate in February of 2018. That means the defendant would earn $20 million after Miss Lee's death. But on August 14th of 2018, everything changed. The defendant learns that he will be replaced in the will. That name that you see in that will right now on the screen, Drew Mars, will be replaced with Stevie Rogers. The defendant knew she had to act fast. She knew she was going to lose everything. And immediately after hearing this conversation, she heard another conversation where Miss Lee calls her personal attorney and asks, and you heard from Mr. Cabrera that appointment was for that same week. So the defendant goes to the pharmacy immediately after, buys chlorandramine. That chlorandramine that he knew looked identical to Miss Lee's Wintrin pills. She couldn't even tell them apart. How did she expect Miss Agatha Lee to? She hoped to induce the allergic reaction Miss Lee had already had from the chlorandramine in 2008. So she goes home, takes those pill bottles in her hand, goes into Miss Lee's room.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I believe the time has elapsed.
Your Honor, from what I discussed earlier, I had 8 minutes and 26 seconds, and currently I have 2 minutes left, 2 minutes and 45 seconds left.
All right, that's a rather large time discrepancy. I'm guessing that timekeepers have not been keeping in touch with each other throughout the round.
I talked to Drew Mars just during the direction. She said I had 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and currently on my clock, there's 2 minutes and 45 seconds left.
Your Honor, I don't know what to say. The sources I've talked to have gotten a different time. I haven't been timing myself, but if she wants to take some more time, I would be okay with that.
All right, we're gonna allow plaintiff counsel to finish her closing argument.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. So she goes into her room, into Miss Lee's room, takes the 2 pills of Wintrin out of the pill organizer and puts in 2 pills of chlorandramine instead. And then she proceeds to hide that bottle of chlorandramine in a black bag in her closet, with her fingerprints found once again. She purposely caused Miss Lee to take her own equivalent of a cyanide capsule because she knew Miss Lee was deathly allergic to chlorandramine. Members of the jury, I want you to think about the one person whose fingerprints were on that bag. The one person who went to the pharmacy. The one person who was going to be in the will, and the one person who was set to lose everything. The defendant, Drew Mars. I want you to find what the evidence supports and what justice demands. Find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, whenever you're ready. Before you begin, though, I don't know if there's a way that we can try and make sure that we're on the same page with time remaining, but that would be a good thing to do.
Of course, Your Honor. And just to be clear, all loss is in about 5 minutes, so should I truncate?
I would say I think we're okay.
Okay. May it please the court. Opposing counsel, members of the jury. And you can say a lot of things about Stevie Rogers, but you can't call her impatient. Because that plan of hers, her scheme to get her hands on the $20 million fortune that her grandmother specifically excluded her from, that plan, it wasn't finished in 2018 when she poisoned Agatha Lee. It wasn't finished when she set up Drew Mars to make it look like she'd done it, or when she filed this lawsuit. No, members of the jury, if you want to know what Stevie Rogers' endgame truly is, folks, you're looking at it. Because make no mistake about why we're in court today. This case, this trial, this very lawsuit, we are living the final step of Stevie Rogers' setup. And she's gotten pretty far. But there's still one obstacle standing in the way of what she wants, and that's you. Because when the plaintiff sued under the Slayer statute, they took on a burden to prove more likely than not that Drew Mars is responsible for the death of Agatha Lee. But the problem for the plaintiff is that the solid evidence that Drew Mars is the person who did that just doesn't exist. And today we showed you why. Drew Mars was set up to be taken down. Let's talk about the evidence. And I want to first talk about the plaintiff's case, what they couldn't show you about Drew Mars, and then let's talk about our case and what we did show you about Stevie Rogers. Now, on their closing argument, the plaintiff used a timeline. Ms. Menta, could we get that timeline up on the screen? And what I found so interesting about this timeline is that if you actually look at what it says, the events they're alleging, they didn't prove a single thing on there other than that Agatha Lee died. Not a single person saw Drew Mars poison Agatha Lee. Not a single person saw Drew Mars buy chloroandramine. I mean, Mr. Bond tried to tell you that if Stevie Rogers had done that, he would have known. But the fact is, at the end of the day, there's no evidence that Drew Mars did. Members of the jury, they leaned their case so heavily on this alleged motive that Stevie Rogers talked to Agatha Lee and that Agatha Lee agreed to change her will. But what evidence did we hear of that? The uncorroborated word of Stevie Rogers, and that was contradicted by not one, but two witnesses. If that conversation didn't happen the way that Stevie Rogers wants you to believe it did, then members of the jury, what motive did Drew Mars really have? I mean, she lived with Agatha Lee for 10 whole years. Then Stevie Rogers comes home, and 1 month later, Agatha Lee is dead. So that brings me to Stevie Rogers. And let's start from the beginning. Now, we know that when Stevie Rogers moved in with her grandmother, she wanted one thing: the money. And we know, because members of the jury, the timing doesn't lie. In February, she learns she's being disinherited. In June, her trust fund runs out, and then lo and behold, 1 month later, she shows up on the doorstep of the grandmother who she hasn't spoken to in 7 years. We know what Stevie Rogers wanted. But how did this scheme to get into her grandmother's will turn into a setup? Well, it happened because of that conversation that Drew Mars told you about and that Ryan Cabrera confirmed. She asks to be put back in the will, and Agatha Lee says no. Think about the timing of that now. The same day that Stevie Rogers learns that the only way she's going to get that money is through a lawsuit like this one, Agatha Lee is dead. But if you have any doubt that Stevie Rogers actually went through with the setup that was created in those hours after that conversation, all you have to do is look at her behavior the next day. Drew Mars wakes her up, tells her that something is wrong with Agatha, but Stevie Rogers doesn't act surprised. She doesn't even go to check if her grandmother is dead. No, she picks up the phone, calls the police, and tells them that her grandmother was murdered. The fact is, before Agatha Lee died, she made a choice to leave everything she owned to the person she cared about most in this world. And no matter how hard Stevie Rogers tries to override her grandmother's last will and testament, no matter how many people she kills, how many investigations she funds, how much evidence she plants, how many lawyers she hires, it doesn't change the fact. Drew Mars had nothing to do with the death of Agatha Lee. She was set up. Don't let Stevie Rogers take her down. Find Drew Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. I have been informed now that we have basically just hit all loss. I've been informed by Tab that we need to not have a rebuttal in order to keep within all loss. I apologize, plaintiff counsel. It's just what I was told by tabulation. So with that, then, the trial has concluded. And Mr. Bailiff, I think you are the person who takes over at this point regarding the live stream.
Yes, Your Honor. I will be